Our next speaker is Dr. Thomas Flohr. He received his PhD in physics from the Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen, Germany, and joined Siemens Healthcare in 1989. He was instrumental in the development of multi-detector row CT, cardiac CT, dual source CT, and photon counting CT. He was head of CT physics and application pre-development at Siemens Healthcare until 2022, and is now senior principal key expert at Siemens Healthcare and an adjunct professor of medical physics at the Eberhard Karls University in Tübingen, Germany. Dr. Flohr was twice a finalist for Germany's Presidential Innovation Award, in 2002 for cardiac CT, and in 2021 for photon counting CT. The only reason they didn't win because they were up against the COVID vaccine. Thomas has more than 100 patents and is the author of more than 230 peer-reviewed publications. Thomas.
So it's an honor to be here, and I'm now covering, let's say, the next decade in CT imaging. It's the decade of multi-slice CT and newer CT concepts. So let me briefly review the clinical role and the progress of CT as you have heard it so far. So in 1971, we saw the introduction of CT, characterized by visualization of the patient's anatomy in single cross-sectional slices, first only of the head, then of the body. And as Zhang said, in 1989, the second life of CT started with the introduction of spiral CT. Now, whole organs could be visualized in one breath hold of the patients. So no longer single axial slices, but whole organs. And end of the 1990s, CT began its third life. That was the introduction of multi-slice technology. Vendors realized that solid-state detectors could be arranged in several rows in the patient's longitudinal direction, and several adjacent anatomical slices of the patients could be acquired. So it started with an early predecessor. This is often forgotten, and I did this here too. That was a two-slice scanner, the Elsin Twin. I think this was introduced in 1993. But in 1998, all major CT vendors started with four-slice systems. And the progress rapidly went on. Now, what is this good for? If you acquire n slices of the patient simultaneously, then the examination time can be much shorter, can be cut down by a factor of n, or the scan range can be correspondingly longer. Or, and this turned out to be the most important benefit of multi-slice CT images, thinner slices could be acquired in clinical routine to approach the goal of isotropic spatial resolution. And with this, the traditional viewing of axial slices was step by step replaced by three-dimensional visualization of CNN. So, just to illustrate this, this is how a CT scan of the lung in an admittedly very sick patient would have looked like with single slice CT. A 7mm slice or so would have to be chosen to scan the entire thorax of the patient in about 30 seconds. And you see a mismatch of the already good spatial resolution in the scan plane and the very bad spatial resolution across the scan plane. And that was the big benefit that multi-slice CT brought. Even with the first four-slice CT systems, this entire volume could be scanned with 1 or 1.25mm slices in about the same scan time, 30 seconds. But now the spatial resolution in the longitudinal direction is much, much better. And with the introduction of 64-slice systems, it is now further improved. We now have sub-millimeter resolution in the longitudinal direction. And above all, the scan time went down dramatically from about 30 seconds to about 4 seconds. So now the entire thorax can be comfortably scanned in just few seconds. That was the big benefit that multi-slice CT brought. This is not just an illustration of the voxel size. You see that in single slice CT, the voxel is highly anisotropic. Though the spatial resolution in the scan plane was already quite good end of the 1990s. But it was a total mismatch with the longitudinal resolution. And with 64 slice CT, we finally were close or are close to the ideal of isotropic spatial resolution for routine applications. Now, what did multi-slice CT change clinically? So the range of CT applications was expanding. We saw a takeoff of CT angiography, of the visualization of the patient's vasculature with CT. Here, the example of a scan of the arteries here in the pelvis. Here, an example of a scan of the arteries in the brain with an early 64 slice CT scanner. We saw that coronary CTA became possible with mechanical CT. So for the first time, the heart of the patient could be scanned with reasonable image quality with just a standard mechanical CT scanner. And this is one of the first examples of an ECG-controlled CT coronary angiography obtained with a 4-slice CT in 2000. And Hounsfield had already hinted at that possibility in his Nobel Prize speech. And this is how this rapidly developed. So this is a 64-slice CT scan of the heart acquired in 2004. We saw new applications emerge. For instance, high-resolution CT urography. Again, an early example with a 64-slice CT coming here from the Clinical Innovation Center. I think Terry, is she here? Yeah, here. It's her case. And we saw that CT evolved into a gatekeeper of the emergency room. So a wide expansion of the range of CT applications made possible by multi-slice CT. And in fact, the number of slices increased rapidly. And this decade is also called the decade of the slice war. We saw 4 slices in 1998 with 2 slightly different detector concepts. One was the so-called adaptive array detector that had detectors with detector elements with different sizes that got wider towards the edge of the detector. And the other one is the fixed array concepts that had detector elements with equal size throughout the detector. Later on, with the introduction of multi-slice CT systems with even more slices, this adaptive array design was given up. So 2001, we already saw 16 slices. These are the slices that were offered by systems of the different vendors at those time. So all sub-millimeter slices, 16 sub-millimeter slices could be acquired. So 64 slices in 2004. And here again, 2 different concepts. Some vendors introduced what they called a C-flying focal spot that doubled the number of acquired slices. And this is why here you see 2 different cones. And this went rapidly on 128, 160, 256 slices already in 2008. So wider and wider detectors for faster coverage of the patient's anatomy in shorter time and with better longitudinal resolution. Now, I talked about this C-flying spot that some vendors introduced. What is this? So the focal spot in the X-ray tube was wobbling backwards and forwards from one projection to the next, so that we got a double sampling, so an oversampling, and we acquired 2 end slices with a sampling distance that was only about half the slice width. So what is this good for? It improves the spatial resolution in the z-axis direction, and it reduced spirohelical artifacts. This was nicely shown here. A nice paper, again in cooperation with the Clinical Innovation Center, that shows the improved resolution along the z-axis with the Z-flying focus spot technique and the reduction of the helical artifacts. So multi-slice CT also posed some challenges to image reconstruction. And these were the toughest problems that, or among the toughest problems that needed to be solved at that time. Why is this? Because suddenly, if you have multiple detector rows, you have a cone angle. So the measurement rays are no longer perpendicular on the patient's longitudinal axis on the z-axis. Now, if you look at the situation in a single slice CT, here you have the detector, here you have the focus. And if you want to scan something like this bone here, and you rotate the measurement system by 180 degrees, you just get the same ray again. You get perfectly aligned data. So if you do the same with a multi-slice CT system, now this is shown here for a 4-slice CT system. Again, the 4 detector rows, the focus, and this ray here to the outer detector element of these 4. Now you see that this ray is tilted by the so-called cone angle, no longer perpendicular on the scan direction. And if you now do the same, now if you now scan this bone and rotate the measurement system by 180 degrees, you see something different. So these measurements are no longer consistent. And this caused problems in image reconstruction. You suddenly saw these strange artifacts, these cone beam artifacts. Now, what to do with this? Luckily, it turned out that up to about 8 slices, this cone angle can be simply neglected, so it's not so bad. So the well-known 2D back projection can simply be extended to multi-slice CT. But what to do with more slices? And there were several attempts with very complicated reconstructions, but in the end, it turned out that the most efficient way to do this is just to use a 3D back projection. Just rebin the data, filter them, and back project each projection directly into the 3D volume, and then simply normalize with the number of rays each one has. So, and with this, the cone beam artifacts go away relatively well. And defiltering was introduced to adjust the slice width of the reconstructed slice. And this was something new. Multi-slice CT brought a decoupling of the acquisition slice width and the reconstructed slice. With the good old single slice spiral CT, you had a collimated slice width and you got a reconstructed slice width that was directly linked to the collimated slice width. Now data acquisition with thin slices became standard, and the reconstruction slice width could be later on adjusted according to clinical needs to balance resolution, image noise, and the number of slices. So, and multiple reconstruction with different slice widths, thin slices for post-processing, thicker slices for viewing, became now routine and standard. Multi-slice CT also enabled this thin slice scanning in a dose-efficient way. So with single slice CT, if you acquired very thin slices, 1 millimeter slices, you often had an overbeaming. So because of the finite width of the focus spot, we had a dose profile, a trapezoidal dose profile at the detector, and these green areas, they would not contribute to the detector signal. They are just wasted dose. And for the single slice systems, the dose efficiency for very thin slices, like 1 millimeter slices, could be lower than 50%. Even with force light scanners, this dramatically improves because the relative contribution of these green penumbra areas is now much smaller. And if you add even more slices, then the dose efficiency becomes even better. So multi-slice CT scanning also enabled thin slice scanning in a dose efficient way. So this was the benefit that multi-slice CT proved. So if we now look at the progress and the clinical role of CT, with the onset of multi-slice CT, we could now scan the whole body with isotropic sub-millimeter resolution for 3D visualization of the anatomy. And we entered into new clinical fields such as CTA or cardiac CT. So from single slices to whole organs to whole body scanning. But CT development went on, and new CT concepts entered the clinical practice in the 2000s. So we saw the introduction of detectors that were wide enough to enable scanning of entire organs in one rotation. Detectors that covered 16 centimeters at the isocenter. What is this good for? For coronary CTA in one heartbeat. And for instance, for dynamic studies, for instance, whole brain perfusion with very good temporal sampling, because you do not need to move anything, you just scan at this point. So wide cone CT enabled coronary CTA in one heartbeat. And if you look at the situation with multi-slice CT with thinner detectors, this is illustrated here, you see that a volume image of the heart needs to be made up by several image stacks acquired in subsequent cardiac cycles of the patient. And if the heart moves, or if the contrast agent concentration changes, you can see these stair-step artifacts. These are variations of the contrast density from one slab to the next. And you also can see some displacements if the heart moves. And this is avoided with a wide cone CT system that just scans the entire heart in one rotation. So this is one benefit of these devices. We also saw the introduction of another CT concept using multiple X-ray sources. Multiple X-ray sources that illuminate the patient simultaneously. They just improve the temporal resolution. Images can be acquired in a shorter time frame to freeze the heart motion in a better way. And an early predecessor of this was the Mayo dynamic spatial reconstructor that has already been shown, 1978. It was a device that had 14 or up to 28 X-ray tubes and could scan up to 60 volumes per second with 28 views over 162 degree scan range. So this is how the system looked like. You have already seen it. And they could acquire coronary arteries, for instance, could scan coronary arteries of a dog, as is shown here. The system never made it, it's really complex and really never made it to a, let's say, mass product for that would have been taken up by a vendor. But we saw at least, let's say, a limited version of it using two X-ray sources, dual source CT. This entered clinical routine in 2006. Dual source CT by simultaneous acquisition of data with two X-ray tubes doubled temporal resolution. You can see this here. So the two measurement systems acquire data simultaneously. And a quarter rotation of data in parallel geometry is sufficient to come up with an image, because these two quarter segments can be just simply appended to give you the half scan that is needed for image reconstruction. You can nicely demonstrate the temporal resolution of this by scanning a rod that rotates at the same speed of the gantry. And the images that each detector produces will be a ring. This will be more or less a ring artifact or a partial ring. And here you see these images of both detectors of this rotating rod. And you see a partial ring for the first detector and a partial ring for the second detector. And if you evaluate how long the angular range of these rings, you can show that they correspond to a temporal resolution of about 80 milliseconds, so a quarter of the rotation time as predicted by this design. So this enabled clinically robust CTA at high heart rates and also with arrhythmic patients. And again, this was shown, this is one of the first cardiac CT scans on a first generation dual source CT here scanned at the Clinical Innovation Center. And you see a nice reconstruction in end systole and end diastole of the same patient. You can perform fast scans, and this is good for pediatrics, non-cooperative patients, and for fast CTAs. Now assume you do a scan of a patient, and this patient here, this is just a doll. And this patient is sedated, so the patient will not move, and this is how the image will look like. Now, assume a standard spiral with a non-sedated patient. So let me, unfortunately, this should run. It's media not found. Oh, this is a pity. But what you would have seen is you would see this motion of the doll, and you would get an image like this. And with a dual source spiral, the scan is so much faster that just by the fast scan speed, the patient motion is avoided. Now, we also saw that dual energy CT came back to the clinical arena. Dual energy CT had already been introduced end of the 1990s, but there was a lack of clinical applications and technical limitations, so it never took off. But in the first decade of the 2000s, we saw it coming up again with three different concepts to acquire the data. Was dual source CT. You can operate both X-ray tubes at different KV settings. With fast KV switching, you can just switch the KV from one projection to the next between 80 and 140 KV. And with a concept that was called dual layer detector. You can just stack two energy integrating detectors on top of each other. And the upper one will register, mostly register the lower energy photons, and the lower one will register the remaining higher energy photons. But this could be used for not only anatomical imaging, but tissue characterization of kidney stones, uric acid, non-uric acid, as an example, or for the quantification of iodine, would compute iodine maps, virtual non-contrast images, and you could quantify the iodine uptake as a measure of the local blood volume for a better differential diagnosis. So for instance, a differentiation, is this now bleeding or iodine uptake? This is no iodine. So putting all this together, we now see the next step in our evolution of CT. So we see the combination of anatomical and functional imaging. So we see systems that could do more than just mapping the anatomy. They could provide dynamic CT studies. They could do tissue characterization with the use of spectral data. And we saw cardiac CT entering clinical routine. And if you now look at this, so we see a gradual evolution of CT from a merely morphological imaging method to a method that provides a comprehensive diagnosis by combining anatomy and function. And that's not the end of CT. You will hear the latest development or about the latest development this afternoon, but that's at least the end of my talk. Thank you very much.